Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom, U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, the 1960s, Vietnam, and the fracturing of liberalism. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause very quickly, and get down the lecture outline for today so you can stay on track. At the same time, pay particular attention to those key terms on your left. They will come in handy as long as you know the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why, and of course be able to tie the terms together. So now that you got that, let's get started. Now, we left off last time with LBJ, and a lot is going on in his administration. 1964, we are flooded with the War on Poverty legislation, the landmark Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Medicare, Medicaid, massive expansion of healthcare, something American liberals have long wanted, massive expansion of the social safety net and civil rights, a massive expansion of the federal government. 1964 election, LBJ wiped the floor with Barry Goldwater. The liberal consensus was here to stay, it seemed. And by the mid-1960s, it seemed that all Americans loved the liberal consensus. They accepted that the welfare state was good, accepted the expansion of civil rights was good. Liberalism dominated American politics, and the Democratic Party was on top of the world, while the Republican Party was left floundering in the wake of Barry Goldwater. And then it all went to pot. This American liberal consensus, to the extent that it existed, began to unravel in the late 1960s. By 1968, the Democratic Party that looked just 4 years earlier that would dominate American politics for years to come, so they thought, drove off into a ditch. So we're going to discuss today how this set the stage for the 1970s and ultimately the rise of conservatism in 1980. Now, it comes down this degradation of the Democratic Party and liberal consensus boils down to three major factors: an increase in radicalism and violence, youth revolt, and of course the Vietnam War. By the end of the 60s, the Democratic Party seemed to be falling apart at the seams. So let's start with what went wrong first. So reason number one, increase in radicalism and violence. Now, we talked about the civil rights movement a lot in the last couple lectures. In the early 1960s, it was all focused on this integrationist phase of the civil rights movement that was, of course, led by the SCLC, CORE, SNCC, and all these other youth in the movement. And of course, the movement focused on, in this integrationist phase, it focused on breaking down segregation in public institutions and securing, of course, voting rights. This phase of the movement climaxed at the March on Washington in 63, and of course the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act in 64, 65. In other words, they accomplished their goal. They got integration. They desegregated all these various public places. But in the wake of all these successes, the civil rights movement for African Americans did what many movements do when they, get what they want, when they succeed. They began to fracture. And sure enough, the civil rights movement of African Americans will begin to fracture post-Voting Rights Act of 1965. I mean, quickly. In fact, on August 11th, 1965, less than a week after this, less than a week after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Los Angeles erupts in riots. Think about this for a minute. African Americans got what they wanted, right? They have the Civil Rights Act. they got the Voting Rights Act, and then a week after the Voting Rights Act is passed, Los Angeles erupts in a race riot. Now, the situation started pretty normally. A drunk driving traffic stop in a predominantly black neighborhood in the city of Watts. It's a Watts neighborhood, predominantly African-American neighborhood. And by the time this riot was done, more than 34 were dead, 4,000 rioters were in jail, and property damage totaled over $35 million. This was a major riot in one of the biggest cities in the country. This left the liberal white Americans stunned, saying, wait, we gave you the Civil Rights Act. We gave you the Voting Rights Act. So what are you upset about now? And yet, the violence just continued unabated. There would be race riots overwhelming in places like Chicago, Cleveland, Newark, Detroit. In fact, in Detroit, tanks will roll down the streets. It will take soldiers to quell the violence. So the question then is, what were African Americans so upset about? Didn't they get what they wanted? Well, the answer is not really. Because civil rights and voting rights, while very, very important, were only half of the equation. And so we move from the integrationist phase to the more radical phase of the civil rights movement. So what are they upset about? Well, by the mid-1960s, about 70% of African Americans lived in urban centers, many of them in the North and West. Most of them in central city downtown neighborhoods that knew nothing of the supposed post-war prosperity. The American dream, supposedly alive and well in the post-World War II era, had pretty much bypassed all African American neighborhoods. That civil rights movement that was so big, the integrationist phase, yeah, it was great. They fought to end segregation in the South, and they did. But outside of the South, what real impact had Dr. King, CORE, SNCC, what impact was there? Remember, they ended Jim Crow laws that only existed in the South. There was still de facto segregation elsewhere thanks to white flight, thanks to just plain out racism, in places like Los Angeles and Watts. It was a black neighborhood that was over-policed. Yes, did the man who got pulled over deserve it? Yeah, probably. He was drunk. But the fact was, the police over-policed that neighborhood because they assumed that African Americans would commit more crime. And where you're looking for crime, you will find it. And so what happens is, just because they weren't written into law segregation ideas, segregation still existed in the North and the West. In the civil rights movement, as we long thought about it through history courses, Dr. King's movement was largely confined to the South. But what about all those who left to the North during World War I and World War II, the Great Migration? What happened to those who went out west in World War II to work in the military industry complex? Life in these neighborhoods was not tangibly improved at all by the post-war prosperity, number one, or by Dr. King's civil rights movement, number two. And so they felt African Americans in the West, in the North, in these urban cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Los Angeles, etc., they pretty much felt the civil rights movement had nothing to offer them. They were no better off, and they felt civil rights leaders like Dr. King were flat out ignoring them. And so what begins to happen post-1965, post-Voting Rights Act, is we see many of these youth who had participated in the early 60s begin to become much more militant and much more radical. And the new rallying cry by 1966 was Black Power. And the two leaders of this were H. Rat Brown and Stokely Carmichael. Now, you remember SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that began with sit-in movements? Well, in 1966, the 25-year-old Stokely Carmichael, pictured on your left, he became the head of the organization. Now, he had been radicalized in the mid-60s, like many, and he was originally born in Trinidad and Tobago. He attended Howard University, the historical black university, and he had been a SNCC activist for years. In fact, he participated in the freedom rides. He was sent to Parchman Prison. But after all these years of nonviolent confrontation, this nonviolent ideas of Dr. King, after nonviolent confrontations with police and getting beaten and thrown in jail, Carmichael finally said enough's enough. We need a different course. And Carmichael began to criticize. He began to complain about the traditional methods of the civil rights movement. And here he explains it to you right here in this video.
Now, let us begin with the modern period of, I guess we could start with 1956 for our generation. This was the beginning of the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King decided that in Montgomery, Alabama, black people had to pay the same prices on the buses as did white people, but we had to sit in the back. And we could only sit in the back if every available seat was taken by a white person. If a white person was standing, a black person could not sit. So Dr. King and his associates got together and said, "This is inhuman. We will boycott your bus system." Now understand what a boycott is. A boycott is a passive act. It is the most passive political act that anyone can commit, a boycott. Because what the boycott was doing was simply saying, we will not ride your buses. No sort of antagonism. He was not even verbally violent. He was peaceful. Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for black people in the United States. His major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart. That's very good. He only made one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none. Has none.
So as you can see, he became very disillusioned with all the suffering he had endured. And so he takes over SNCC and becomes a much more radicalized version of SNCC. It's no longer living up to his name of nonviolent. Now, he begins to take this different course. This growing discontent would create two factions within the movement. One who favored the continuation of Dr. King, nonviolence, and those who favored this idea of black power, revolutionary ideas, the use of violence. Now, Carmichael will decide to leave SNCC in 1967, and instead he'll move on to a new place. Instead, H. Rat Brown, picture on your right, he will succeed Stokely Carmichael as the leader of SNCC, and he will begin to urge SNCC members and all African Americans to arm themselves. Why? Because it was time to fight violence with violence, according to people like H. Rat Brown and Stokely Carmichael. Black power. Now, Carmichael leaves SNCC, H. Rat Brown takes over, and Stokely Carmichael moves on to a new group known as the Black Panther Party. Pictured here. This is the traditional view of how people tend to remember and look at the Black Panther Party. Now, the Black Panther Party were a group of black separatists and urban revolutionaries founded in Oakland in 1966. They terrified white America because they used guns and they believed that you need black separatism. In other words, blacks needed a separate nation unto themselves because whites will never accept them. Sound familiar? Yep, we're going all the way back to the UNIA, back to the 1920s, with the idea of black nationalism under Marcus Garvey. Now, I told you it would come back. It was an undercurrent through the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. But black power reemerges in the 1960s. Only now, it's not called black nationalism. We now call it black power. Now, the Black Panther Party was, in fact, horrific if you were the white public. Because this picture right here you see on your screen is how whites viewed them. And yes, they were militant. Yes, they dressed like a military. They took their ideas actually from Vietnam. Yes, they armed themselves because they felt they had to in the face of white prejudice. But this is only one side of the Black Panther Party. It's a side you see if you watch in movies often. If you watch Forrest Gump again. Forrest Gump depicts them as being very verbally violent and aggressive, as Forrest is visiting Washington, D.C. after the Vietnam War. But they also did a lot of different things, and a lot of good in neighborhoods, because yes, they were militant and sometimes violent. But this was also the Black Panther Party pictured here. Within inner city, all black neighborhoods, they offered free breakfast programs to underprivileged kids. Nowadays, many students are given breakfast at school, either free or reduced, so that students have a full stomach to eat before they go to school. Because it was found that if students are hungry when they enter school, they will not perform as well during the school hours because they're hungry all day. Therefore, schools often feed them now. But that was not the case in the 1960s yet. And therefore, the Black Panther Party would open up these rooms in food kitchens so that underprivileged inner city black boys and girls could get a breakfast before they went to school. They also began to open up community health clinics because they found out with a quick search that there were no good health clinics in the inner cities in predominantly all black or Latino neighborhoods. And so the Black Panther Party and their counterparts, the Brown Berets for Mexican Americans, they began to open up clinics, health clinics, so that people who were sick had a place to go get medicine, go get treatment. Because otherwise they had to go out into the suburbs to the white areas where they were not accepted at due to de facto segregation laws. Even though they weren't written into code, you just were not accepted there. And as a result, there are two sides to this Black Panther Party ideal. So on the one hand, yes, they were militant. They could be violent. They were very radical. They did want separatism. But on the other hand, they were just trying to point out that there was something called economic citizenship. That even though, yes, the segregation had been disallowed, that we have integrated public schools, that did not mean all things are better. Despite the fact they were given equal opportunity education, did not mean they had equal access to other things like good jobs, like equal pay. And so for these urban areas, they felt the civil rights movement had left them behind, left them out. And so you start seeing the rise of Black power and other more radical groups like, of course, Malcolm X. The face of Black power, of course, was Malcolm X. Now, his real name is Malcolm Little. He denoted himself X for his lost African surname due to slavery and being brought over here from Africa. Not him personally, but his ancestors. And from childhood, he'd been raised in a poor urban neighborhood. He became a disciple of a man by the name of Elijah Muhammad, who was a Black Muslim leader of a group known as the Nation of Islam. Now, he's diametrically opposed Dr. Martin Luther King. He believed that, yes, African Americans need to be more extreme. See the quote on the screen? Yes, I'm an extremist. The black race in the United States is in extremely bad shape. You show me a black man who isn't an extremist, and I'll show you one who needs psychiatric attention. Now picture that with the voice of Denzel Washington and go watch the movie X. Many, including some of the civil rights movement leadership, like Dr. King, would accuse Malcolm X of being a segregationist, a black supremacist, and ultimately seeing him as a threat to race relations. But can you fully blame him? Because the movement for civil rights movement is not really impacting the northern urban environments where they aren't segregated. I mean, they are by de facto reasons of wealth, but they aren't segregated in schools necessarily. They don't have equal access to opportunity. They don't have equal access to get into colleges, and therefore they don't get the equal access to equal jobs or equal pay. And so while they have voting rights, they have civil rights, they don't have economic citizenship whereby they can participate freely in the economic capitalist system. And so Malcolm X began to speak on street corners, drawing large crowds. And after a few years of this, he actually will convert to Sunni Islam, and he will make his pilgrimage to Mecca. And at this point, he starts to turn away from the traditional Nation of Islam ideologies. He becomes a little less radical, actually. He widens his views beyond just black and white race issues. In some ways, he actually becomes more inclusive of women's rights, Latino rights. But he still, of course, is a big critic of racism in a white-dominated society. But it was this turn that gets him in trouble, because he begins to speak out against Elijah Muhammad, his former mentor in Nation of Islam, who was quite jealous of Malcolm X's popularity. And as he begins to make public remarks against Elijah Muhammad, members of the Nation of Islam will actually come and assassinate him in 1965 at age 39. So what is his legacy, though? Well, yes, he was a very popular voice, a popular face of the more radical movement. He did advocate for self-defense. He believed in separatism. He believed in arming themselves. He believed in empowering African Americans to influence other groups. And because of him, and because of Stokely Carmichael, because of H. Rap Brown, the idea of black power lives on. Even though it never attracts more than a minority, it does bring attention to the cause. And it also began to change, even though all African Americans did not join the Black Power movement, again, most did not, it did begin to change the way African Americans viewed themselves, because they began to embrace their blackness. So even if they weren't separatists, even if they weren't militant and carried semi-automatic rifles, they began to embrace that, hey, we're black, we're proud, that black is beautiful. And that became their slogan. Blackness was no longer seen as a weakness because they weren't white. Blackness became a source of pride and culture. And the second big legacy of the Black Power movement was it forced Dr. King and all of these other mainstream civil rights groups to launch a new era of the civil rights program that focused on the economic plights of urban African Americans in the North and West. Because black urban poverty, income inequality, underemployment, unemployment, urban hopelessness, this is what becomes to dominate the movement going forward. Now, at the same time, however, as African Americans are becoming more radical, so are young people. As black power and racial violence dominated the headlines, there also began a major youth revolt in the 1960s that would last into the 1970s. You see, what happens is, by the 1960s, all those baby boomers, the children born after World War II, they're maturing. And they're going to high school, they're going to college now. And they differ very much from their parents because they had experienced neither the economic depression of the Great Depression nor a major war, World War II. In addition, record number of these young adults were now attending higher education in college. College enrollment quadrupled from 1945 to 1970. And of course, we already discussed, a lot of these students are becoming much more liberal-minded, becoming much more radicalized. Remember, a lot of college students were the ones involved in the sit-ins of the 60s in Greensboro, Alabama, or Greensboro, North Carolina, I mean. And it wasn't just African Americans, it was white college students also getting involved in this movement. And so what happens is many college campuses become hotbeds for activism, radicalism among the youth, both white and black. So for instance, in 1962, Tom Hayden and Al Haber, pictured here, students at the University of Michigan, go blue, they convened and they formed a group known as the Students for a Democratic Society, aka SDS. Now, what they did is they figured they couldn't do it on college campus in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So they went to Port Huron, right on the border of Canada, and they gathered 60 youth activists, and they drafted what was called the Port Huron Statement. There you picture there. In this statement, they said, quote, "We are the people of this generation, bred in at least moderate comfort, housed in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit," unquote. Think about this for a minute. They admit they're middle class. They have it good. Remember, they said, we're bred in moderate comfort. We're housed in good universities. But yet we look at the world around us and we're uncomfortable with it. We don't like it. We don't like what we're seeing. And what they were arguing was that America, as a capitalist democratic nation, was dominated by huge power structures. Government, corporations, unions, universities, and all these things, they argued, conspired to oppress and alienate the individual. Inspired by the civil rights movement, Hayden declared that students had the power to restore, quote unquote, participatory democracy to American life. And they began to adopt the term the New Left. These were people who just wanted to have their voices heard in America. They didn't want to be pushed down by the corporate entities that said, you should do this, you should do that. They're pushing against the conformity. So in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, the New Left was born with the SDS. Just 2 years later, out in Berkeley, California, we had the free speech movement. Several students had just returned to campus for the fall semester after participating in the Freedom Summer. They had then gone on to, with SNCC, to have voter registration drives. Then when they returned back for the fall semester, they found out that the chancellor had passed a rule that said the students could no longer protest or have political demonstrations at the Telegraph Avenue street corner, which is where students normally gathered to voice their concerns, discuss the big issues, and have protests. Now, they did the only sane thing they thought they could do. They followed the ways of SNCC and staged a sit-in right at the scene. Over 2,000 students sat down on the corner to protest the chancellor's ruling. They could not protest there. This birthed what became known as the free speech movement. They have the right to free speech. They have the right to peacefully assemble. After a 32-hour standoff, the administration relented, giving students in the New Left a major victory. And the tactics of the free speech movement, the idea of a sit-in, began to spread through college campuses across the nation. It ignited confrontations between radicalized students and the more conservative administrators. The university, they criticized it as a, quote, depersonalized, unresponsive bureaucracy. And this became a hotbed of the political activity. Now, I want to give you a modern example of this. About 10 years ago, well, 8 years ago now, I was a grad student at the University of Houston. And As a TA, I worked as a TA while I went to school there to help pay for my education. And we got paid very little for a semester. We got paid, well, quite honestly, below the poverty line, to the point where our entire TA salary would pay for our rent on our apartments. Think about that for a minute. The average rent in Houston, about $1,000. That's all the money we made. We only had about $200 left over to pay for groceries, gas, electricity, utilities, or just buy books for class. And students began to argue this was not fair because under our TA agreement, teacher assistant agreement, we could not have outside work beyond our TA work. Now, theoretically, that was good because we want to focus on school, which was the point. But when you can't afford to live, it's not feasible. And so students staged a sit-in in the president of University Houston's office. And sure enough, we got a substantial pay raise as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying it was great, but it was livable if you were a single college student. Now, thankfully for me, I was married, my wife had a full-time job. But for many grad students, this became the only way for them to survive. So it is still a popular, effective movement to the present day. Now, there was one thing that the youth had right, and that was that the federal government was becoming more depersonalized, despite all the good that LBJ had been doing with the Great Society. In many ways, these youth were right. The government was becoming oppressive. It was not listening to the needs of the youth, and this is nowhere more clearly seen than the issue of the Vietnam War. Now, let's take a minute here and give some background here so you understand why the youth are so upset. So in 1964, on August 2nd, there was a minor skirmish in the South China Sea. And on August 2nd, 1964, there was a minor skirmish between the 3 North Vietnamese ships and an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, 2 days later, there was an alleged second attack on August 4th by the North Vietnamese Navy. Now, the details are a little bit murky, but nonetheless, the people of North Vietnam in Hanoi said we didn't do it. They denied the attack. Now, for what reason? It makes no sense for them to lie because there had already been a minor skirmish. LBJ, however, ordered retaliatory airstrikes on the bases of the North Vietnamese. So on August 4th, there was a second supposed attack that North Vietnam denied, but LBJ used the supposed attack to launch an airstrike at North Vietnam. Then he went to address the American people, saying that Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam were the aggressor. Sound familiar? Hitler did it with Poland. We did it back in the Mexican-American War. Supposedly, they fired first, and so now we have a reason to declare war. Well, this time, Congress gave LBJ a blank check. But they passed what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, in which case LBJ now had the power to conduct military operation in Southeast Asia without congressional approval. Congress willingly gave up their right to declare war and instead gave it to the president, one man. Always a dangerous thing to give power to one man. In this case, think about it for a minute. He had the power to conduct warfare in Southeast Asia, not just Vietnam, not just North Vietnam, in all of Southeast Asia. This is broad power. It gave Johnson the approval to do, quote, take all necessary steps, including the use of arms force, to assist any state requesting assistance in defense of its freedom, unquote. This gives Johnson a blank check to escalate the war. LBJ believed that America needed to prevail in Vietnam in order to maintain credibility. He didn't want the United States to appear weak in Europe or against communism. In other words, to ensure and reinforce foreign credibility, LBJ ratcheted up our involvement in Vietnam. Now, fall of 1965, 165,000 ground troops enter Vietnam. And then slowly over the next couple of years, we will raise to the point over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. That's just boots on the ground. In addition, between 1965 and 1967, the United States will drop more bombs on Vietnam than all of the Allies in World War II combined. Think of that staggering number, this tiny, thin land of Vietnam. We dropped more bombs on Vietnam in 2 years than all the Allies, France, Britain, Russia, us, did in World War II combined. Unfortunately, dropping bombs was not the most effective strategy because we were not fighting a traditional warfare against the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong in the South. This was guerrilla warfare. And in addition to our bombs not being effective, the goal of establishing a credible government in South Vietnam was undermined because we were killing thousands upon thousands of innocent Vietnamese civilians. As we were fighting this guerrilla warfare, we didn't know how to fight. In the end, this created resentment between the South Vietnamese and America and the North Vietnamese and America. In total, the Vietnam War would cost $150 billion with a B to the American taxpayers. It was a quagmire that Johnson knew was a disaster, but he could not pull out of. He believed that he could focus and be a great president on foreign policy. He became increasingly constrained by the Vietnam War, and it would ultimately be the end of him. So why were the kids mad? Well, as American involvement in the war increased, the government had to use the draft in the form of a lottery to get enough warm bodies for the war. As the war raged on, more young bodies kept coming back in flag-draped caskets. It became more and more unpopular. Throughout the course of the war, 58,000 Americans died. Another 300,000 were wounded. In total, nearly 3.5 million men will serve in the Vietnam War. 2.2 million of those will be drafted. And then, even though there's still another 1.3 million left over, many of those people did actually volunteer just because they knew they were getting drafted otherwise. And this draft fueled a vigorous anti-war resentment among the youth, especially those who were already involved in the New Left. Thousands upon thousands of young men refused to obey their draft notices, many of whom were sent to prison rather than enlist or rather than be drafted. Some fled to Canada. Over 570,000 dodged the draft. This does not count those who got medical clearances like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. In the spring of 1967, 500,000 war protesters converged on New York Central Park to burn their draft cards you see pictured there, burn them in coffee cans. And while they're there, they shouted things like, quote, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today?" Unquote. The result of this was a very violent reaction. So, things in the state of the country right now, in the late 60s, we have racial violence, we have youth radicalism, we have a raging Vietnam War, and we have anti-war protests all throughout our country. The American liberal consensus is crumbling, and all of this leads us to 1968. 1968 fascinates historians, but that will be a topic for our next lecture. So for now, if you like this video, click the like button and please subscribe to my channel. Until next time, though, take care and